Okay, I think you can go, Tomasz.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Greetings to everybody that are watching us. Today, we will speak about the European Union after the wall, aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the civic and institutional evolution of the European Union. But first, let me give you some introductory notes. This discussion today is part of a series of ongoing conferences and debates about Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall related with the project Nowall, from Helsinki to Berlin, Europe, and the end of the Cold War. This project is developed by the Center of International Studies of ISCTE, UL, a public university in Lisbon, with the collaboration of young educators, CAT projects, the NGO Europa Norwet, and the University of Helsinki. So my first greetings and thankings words will go to Professor Luís Nuno Rodrigues, the Nowall project coordinator, Sylvia Barrett, and Felix Soares from Young Educators, who so kindly and proficiently organized this initiative. The Nowall project emphasizes the role of European actors in the final years of the Cold War and in the developments that culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall. In this sense, it traces the origins of this role from Helsinki Summit in 1975 to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, emphasizing the European actors such as the European Economic Community, political leaders, NGOs, and youth and students activist groups in promoting political contacts, cultural exchanges, and the dissemination of values such as freedom, democracy, and human rights between the two sides of the Berlin Wall. So today we'll discuss the European Union after the wall. For that, I have here with me four speakers that are Professor Madalena Maior Rezende from Nova University of Lisbon, Professor Konrad Jarausch from University of North Carolina, Dr. Jacek Kołtan from European Solidarity Center at Gdańsk, and finally, our last speaker will be Professor Paulo Vila Maior from Fernando Pessoa University of Porto. I'm Tomás Santos, and I'm president of the Portuguese Association of European Studies, and I will be your host for this evening. Our discussion today will revolve around three key aspects: the evolution of Europe and the European project after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the institutional configuration of the European Union, from the progressive enlargements of the role of Europe relation to solidarity between member states, and finally, we'll have the opportunity to look from the lens of history to the current moment in Europe. Our session will have two moments. First, we'll begin with the initial presentations from our speakers, followed by a moment of questions and answers. All those who have questions, please post them in the chat. It is the button with the message symbol that you have below in the center on your control panel. So with no further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Madalena Maior Rezende, who is Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Studies in Nova University of Lisbon. Her research focuses on the intersection between religion and politics, on nationalism and on political parties. Her most recent publication is A Holy Alliance Between the Catholic Church and Constitution Makers, the diffusion of the clause of cooperation in third wave democracies. Today, she will talk about the attempt to reestablish the European narrative after the end of the Cold War. So, Professor Madalena, please proceed to follow.
Hello, everybody. First, thank you very much for the...
I think we are not hearing you.
Actually, now
it's okay. Now you can proceed. Yeah.
No.
You can go.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Just to have I prepared about 5-10 minutes presentation. Is that more or less what is expected, I think, no?
Yes, yes, yes. Please do it. You can go.
Okay. So my okay, thank you. So first, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's with a big pleasure. I have been studying and working in Poland and in Berlin, and I'm currently in Berlin. So it is with a lot of interest that I heard about this conference, and very happy to participate. My current work is about the narrative of European integration. So the different narratives of European integration, and in particular the importance of the Catholic narrative of European integration. And it kind of fits this conference in the sense that one of my main points is to say that with the end of the Cold War, which is symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Catholic narrative of European integration somehow came to an end or became less relevant. And this is an aspect to understand the different somehow been and so the start of the Cold War, a synthesis of ideas between
I think we're having some troubles with your transmission. Felix, can you check what happened? May I proceed with the
Yes, you should proceed, and then we will invite her to enter again. Okay, so go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. So let me introduce Professor Konrad Jarausch, who is the Lurkey Professor of European Civilization at the University of North Carolina and the past director of the Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam, Germany. Among the many libs and fellowships, he is a double alumnus of the Wilson Center. He has about 50 monographs and edited volumes cover German and European history, mostly during the 20th century. Some of his recent books are Reluctant Compliance, Wehrmacht Soldiers' Letters from the Eastern Front, Out of Ashes, A New History of Europe in the 20th Century, and Broken Lives, How Ordinary Germans Experienced the 20th Century. Today, he will speak about the return of the East Central European countries to Europe. Please, Professor Konrad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay.
You can proceed.
I want to thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I haven't been considered a young scholar for quite a few decades, so that I take as a compliment. What I want to do is very briefly sketch a few of the implications of the overthrow of communism or the collapse of communism, depending upon how you conceptualize it. And let me start by saying the peaceful revolution of 1989, 1990 has simply been the biggest transformation of Europe since 1945. It's what the historians like to call a watershed, namely something that changed fundamentally. The consequences of it, of course, are things that we all live with, even in Western Europe, although less consciously than in the East. And there is, as not surprisingly, also considerable controversy about the implications of what all of that means. Let me begin my points with pointing to the revival of Middle Europa. That is a German concept from the 19th century that was propagated during the First World War, namely Central Europe. And surprisingly enough, in the 1980s, it re-emerged among intellectuals of some of the Central European countries who were protesting against Russian domination and communist ideology. And they did so by claiming to be European rather than Eurasian. It simply meant that they too wanted to be considered part of Western Europe, and they wanted to restore a Central Europe as a kind of counterweight and in a way of escaping the domination of the Soviet Union. The chance for the realization of all of this came very surprisingly with the common European home rhetoric of Gorbachev, who ended up being an unwitting facilitator of change by repudiating the Brezhnev doctrine and thereby opened the door for dissidents and various kinds of protest movements in East Central Europe, starting with Solidarność and then including the Hungarian burial protests for Imre Nagy, and jumping from there to the East German set. These things we all call a peaceful revolution, and they are a mixture, of course, of different kinds of assumptions and goals, starting with anti-communism, but also involving consumer prosperity that was market-based and a desire for national independence. So instead of just having a single united opposition movement in East Central Europe, you have different kinds of strains, including the Catholic Church, about which we will hear, I think, more in a moment. So this has, at least in some places, been called peaceful revolution. Peaceful because, except for Romania, there was hardly any bloodshed. It was not World War III, fortunately, and revolution because it was not just a change of government, but it was also a complete transformation of the political system, of the social system, of the economy, of the cultural orientation, and so on. Of course, there are some dissidents who no longer want to talk about revolution because they're disappointed in some of the consequences. But I think in terms of political science definitions, we still have to hang on to that concept. Now, the consequence, and this is what we're talking about today, is the reemergence of independent nation states out of prior satellite countries of the Soviet Union. The lifting of the Iron Curtain re-centered Europe and shifted the gravity of European affairs from France and Brussels on the one hand, more towards Germany and towards East Central Europe. And of course, national states re-emerged. They had been there under communism, but covered up with socialist internationalism and now reasserted themselves. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, of course, also ended up splitting the country into two parts. Now, among these changes, probably the most dramatic is German reunification, which up to the spring of 1990 proceeded along the same lines as the protest movements and the overthrow of communism in other East Central European countries, including the Round Table that then agreed on free elections. But with the fall of the wall, the possibility of East Germany joining the West became a realistic option, and the slogans in the Monday night protests changed from "We are the people" to "We are one people" or "one nation." And after Helmut Kohl's visit to Dresden in December 1989, and after the 10-point plan, this became an actual priority of regular politics. Of course, then by not just restoring a country which had existed already under Soviet control, but merging into West Germany, a chastened German national state reemerged. The price of it was the acceptance of the post-war frontiers between Poland and Germany. And I think we are all happy that this took place without any violence on anybody's part, and that the interwar revisionism, that is, attempt to overthrow the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, is not really rearing its ugly head again. At least I don't see it. Now, further east, of course, it isn't just the reemergence of nation states, but also it is the splintering of the Soviet Union, the crumbling of the ethnic border areas in the Baltics, in Ukraine and Belarus, which gained independence, and the reemergence of Russia as an ethnically more homogeneous country with this Commonwealth of Independent States as an attempt to preserve its own influence. Now, all of this led to a post-communist transformation. That transformation research by political scientists emphasizes a return of democratic self-government that is filling the remnants with real life. There are remnants of parliamentarianism even under the Soviet Union and so on, and leading to the embrace of a neoliberal marketization that was very shocking in many places, and an increase in social stratification and a gain in cultural pluralism. Eventually, and I'm almost finished, this led to the inclusion in Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union, but also the creation of new frontiers, because Ukraine, Belarus, and so on are not in European institutions. And of course, there are Russian ethnic minorities in various border countries, such as in the Baltics and in Moldova. And of course, there was the tragic and very bloody breakup of Yugoslavia that also was related to some degree with the collapse of communism. Now, the question of interpretation is really, is this a success story, or is this a story of disappointments? And of course, it depends entirely upon who you are. If you are a former dissident, you are happy that you're no longer being spied on by the Stasi or the various other secret services. Whereas if you're a former apparatchik and of the nomenclatura, then you have probably lost power, and maybe you have been publicly insulted and so on, and you kind of wonder, where the good old time went to. So what some of us would argue, and I do so in the book that I'm just about, have the proofs on my desk, is that it's both, that it is a success story to some degree, because it was peaceful, it opened up new life chances, but it also created a lot of challenges and some disappointments, like the new stratification, the difference between rich and poor, and so on, so that it all depends upon the constructive use that everybody in East Central Europe, in Central Europe, and of course in Western Europe and Brussels makes of these new opportunities, whether or not they turn into negatives or whether they turn into something that will help Europe eventually to grow together even further than it is now. Okay, this is all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Professor Konrad Jarausch, for your noteworthy presentation. Let me just tell you that for technical issues, this thing about digital conference has some good things, but also has some bad things. So for technical issues, we unfortunately could not count with the intervention of Professor Madalena Maior. It's a pity, but of course it is for us a great pleasure to having her, but it will not possible this time. I'm sure that we will have another opportunity. So let's continue. I would like now to introduce Dr. Jacek Kołtan, who is a PhD, philosopher and political scientist. He's a director, representative for research at the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk, Poland. He studied at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland, and in Humboldt Universitat and Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany. He has been a fellow of the CAD Scholarship Fund in Berlin and a visiting scholar of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His research interests cover social and political theory, history of solidarity idea, social movements, hermeneutics, as well as social design and anthropology. He is author of Solidarity, Democracy, Europe, Solidarity and the Crisis of Trust, European Solidarity Center Permanent Exhibition, and The Peaceful Revolution, among other publications. Finally, he teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts in Gdańsk and in the Warsaw University. Today, he will tell us about Europe, solidarity, and the lost treasure of the revolution. Please, Mr. Konrad, may you proceed?
Okay. Thank you for this kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you, even if it's unfortunately online and not on site. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I prepared it for about 15 minutes, and now I'm a little bit afraid that I'll violate the rules you established, because there was talk about 5 till 10 minutes, but in case it's too long, just please let me know. Okay, I'll try to share my presentation with you with the hope it will succeed. Do you see the presentation or?
Yes, we see.
Yeah. Okay.
If you want to put it in, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wait a minute.
Oh.
I'll try once again. That's the challenge of technology, which makes us the happiest people in the world and the most traveled ones at the same time, unfortunately. Let us check it out once again. Okay, I hope you see the presentation right now.
We see.
Yeah.
We see.
Okay. So, okay. What I wanted to talk about is actually to talk about the Solidarity Revolution in Poland and its impact and the meaning for the recent decades of European history, especially the European history of freedom. I mean, I work at the European Solidarity Center. That's the building in the heart of the Gdańsk shipyard where Solidarity was born. And I thought I will share with you actually two stories. The first one is the one that the 21st century was born a little bit earlier than expected. And instead of the magnificent year 2000, the 21st century came a bit earlier, around the year 1980. And the reason for that is actually five politicians, and a very strong personalities which actually shaped the future of the world, and started introducing processes that we are that we still can experience nowadays. By talking about them, I mean, wait a minute, I have to check one thing. Okay, now the presentation is back, I hope. Okay, and you still
yes,
see
we can see it. We can see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so first I would like to talk about five political virtuosos which came to power between the 1978 and 1981. And I do believe it creates a kind of a frame for thinking about the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. And they created actually a political and economic frame which had a huge impact on what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in the last decade. So the first person I'd love to talk about is Deng Xiaoping, a very experienced politician who, I mean, with his career full of ups and downs, was developed in the shadow of Mao Zedong. But Deng came to power in 1978 and initiated a lot of political reforms, which created actually the today's power of modern China. So he was introducing the new constitution, which is still the foundation of the contemporary Chinese state. But at the same time, he began a kind of a profound economic reform, not only by opening the internal market for foreign investments, but also advanced technologies, but also by limiting economic collectivism and allowing development of the family farms, which was a huge step forward in the very radicalized and very brutal communist economy at that time in China. So he initiated reforms that opened the economy of the Middle Kingdom to the practices of capitalism. And I mean, that offered or created a kind of a new world power for the next decades. Another person is Karol Wojtyła, a Polish priest, bishop, and then the cardinal of the Polish Catholic Church that 1978 became the Pope John Paul II. It was October 1978. For the first time in history, someone from outside the Italian circle has taken over this papal seat. And as John Paul II, he deeply redefined the role of the head of the church, becoming a very dedicated opponent of authoritarian communism. That's the one thing. But also traveling around the world, he inscribed a represented religious tradition into a global framework using the language of popular culture. Actually, the pop culture and the religion played a very important role in his agenda. He was called the Pilgrim Pope. He popularized the message of the Catholic Church. But in 1979, he came to Poland for the very first time as a new pope. And that was a very important impulse for change in the society suppressed by the communist regime at that time. And one cannot forget 1980, one of the largest social movements in the history the 20th century history of the world was born. It was the Solidarity movement in Poland. The third person is the Ayatollah Khomeini, someone who included religion in the political project and contributed to religious radicalization. In February 1979, he proclaimed Iranian Revolution and Islamic government. And it's not really difficult to see the repercussions of this event of the February 1979 in other parts of the Islamic world. One cannot forget it has a lot to do with the conflict in Afghanistan, which started at the end of 1979 with the aggression of USSR, which became a kind of experimental field also for religious radicalization with a lot of political consequences, which still can be felt today. One cannot forget it was during the Sunni rebellion, which is also financially supported by the United States, that military religious groups began to be very well organized. And in the following decades, Islamic terrorism was born from the network of this kind of Arab militants fighting in Afghanistan at that time. And it's a classic example of which also Al-Qaeda, which dates back to the Afghan conflict, was born. So it's actually fascinating that this kind of impulses those people gave develops into entire political processes we have to face today. The fourth personality or the fourth politician on the scene is Margaret Thatcher, which came to power in 1979. She became the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and her reforms contributed to the internationalization of economies, the privatization processes she launched. It was the end of social democratic order established after the Second World War, played a very important role for the world, not only for Europe. And the fifth personality is Ronald Reagan, who in January 1981 started to be the president of the United States of America, together with Margaret Thatcher. He introduced a lot of economic reforms with deregulation of the market, privatization processes, which were the key in the entire ideology of neoliberalism, so important for the further development of the 80s and the 90s, also of Europe, created a kind of multinational global financial flows, which started to be an absolute reference point in the global economy. So only a few years, and these very strong personalities are changing the entire international frame in which the historical processes are taking place. So we see with Khomeini, we see the religious radicalization, and also as an impulse for international terrorism. This moment plays a very important role. We have also John Paul II with his anti-communism agenda. We have a Deng Xiaoping with his state capitalism control, state capitalism he introduced at the end of the 70s and with the beginning of the 80s. And then China got one of the leading roles on the international scene. And we have Thatcher and Reagan with this neoliberal capitalist agenda, but also anti-communism. Actually, and that's the one of the theses of very interesting book written by Christian Carroll, Strange Rebels. Actually, all of them have a lot to do with anti-communism or anti-leftist sentiment. It's easy to understand it in case of Thatcher and Reagan. It's also easy to understand it in case of Polish Pope John Paul II. But it's also the case of Khomeini and Deng Xiaoping, who are fighting with this radicalized leftists or communists group in their countries. So it's what they represent. It's actually a kind of a counter-revolution which started with the beginning of the 80s and the end of the 70s. And it's also interesting to take a look at some crucial culmination points. And one of them is the 4th of June, 1989. I'm always surprised when I think about this moment in the world history, not only because of the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. That's the starting point, because the free election in Poland are taking place, but also because some other important moments. One day before, Ayatollah Khomeini has died, and that's another moment for radicalization of the political religious project in Iran, in religious state in Iran. It's the moment of the 4th of June is the moment of the first democratic elections in Central and Eastern Europe, which is actually a starting point for the fall of communism between the 1989 and 1991. But it's at the same time, on the 4th of June, the massacre on Tiananmen Square in China, in Beijing, had taken place. And the reason for that was also observing the processes that are taking place in Europe and especially in Poland. So the power, Chinese power, scared by the consequences of this political break, decided to intervene with military in a very brutal way. Thousands of people have been killed. So you see the pictures from Tiananmen Square from the 3rd of June 1989. So of course, when we think about these 5 personalities and these 5 impulses for the birth of the 21st century, we can see the further consequences of that. One of them is of course the terrorist radicalization and international terrorism that has a moment of culmination on the 11th of September 2001. We have also the global financial crisis that has a lot to do with neoliberal economy introduced in the beginning of the 80s, extremely successful in the 80s and the 90s. But we have also a lot of problems with, for example, COVID pandemic 2020 in China, where the undemocratic way of ruling the country does not allow to intervene as fast as it's possible when the state gets information about the danger of the COVID-19. And another moment I would concentrate on, and that's the second story after the story of the birth of the 21st century, is the moment of the birth of solidarity. Because 1980 is also, and I mentioned it already as I was talking about the John Paul II, it's also the moment where one of the greatest movements of the second part of the 20th century was born, Solidarity Movement in Poland in August 1980. One cannot forget, it's almost 10 million people that mobilized together against the authoritarian rulers, the authoritarian communism in Poland. When we take into consideration that Poland was at that time 34 million citizens, and when we exclude children under the age, people under the age of 18, then we get almost every second citizen engaging in solidarity movement. It's a huge mobilization. So it's a very revolutionary wave that took place at that time. One of the philosophers engaged in solidarity movement, Joseph Tischner, wrote, "The workers' protest in August 1980 referred not only to the economic conditions characterizing the state, but primarily to the even more unbearable relationships between people. Economic and strictly political issues were only a part of more fundamental matters. The solidarity ethos is a synthesis of rebellion and hope, a protest against a type of evil, and a project for better organization of social life. So we had a fascinating moment of social mobilization, but it's also a fascinating moment of democratization. On the photo, you can see the leader of the movement, Lech Wałęsa, and you can see the crowds gathering together and trying to get a kind of empowerment and to have an impact on the political reality of that time. But one of the most important moments for the history of solidarity movement was also the first Congress, when people gathered together and decided to talk about the future of the country, but also the future of Europe. So what I would like to underline in the legacy of solidarity movement in the 80s is the first thing, it was the philosophy of non-violent struggle was actually a crucial element of the strategy solidarity developed. So solidarity became a kind of a synthesis of the experience of the entire region in the communist era. And when we think about the crucial dramatic moments after the Second World War, with the uprising in East Germany in 1953, then in Poznan in Poland in 1956, then the famous Hungarian Revolution or Hungarian uprising in 1956, or the Prague Spring 68, then we get a very bloody, very dramatic, very brutal picture of what happened in Central and Eastern Europe. Actually, solidarity changed it in a very profound way. So I understand or interpret solidarity as actually a kind of synthesis where also the failures of using violence as a solution that fails had been understood properly, and actually the lesson from very bloody experience of the Central and Eastern European countries was solidarity, with a great intellectual debate with many intellectuals from that region, like Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, and the others, dealing with non-violence and with the meaning of the idea of solidarity as a hope for the future transformation, political transformation of the country. So the philosophy of non-violence was one of the crucial elements of solidarity movement. The second one was the politics of everyday life. So one cannot forget it's the bottom-up power to change the world, which created a very specific politics of everyday life. So in my opinion, solidarity did a kind of a great deal of intellectual, but also moral work to rediscover the importance of democracy in everyday life. It was people's life where people met personal choices, had to be confronted with anxieties and desires, and pervasive need to change reality. That was the moment that became the real element of the politics. And as Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher, stated, he was also supporting solidarity. In his comments on this new political culture, he paid particular attention to the issue of moralizing politics and politicizing existence, which I think it's very, very interesting point. And the third element of the heritage or legacy of solidarity movement is it's a sense of the common good that provided the movement with real political subjectivity. On the picture, you see the first Congress of Solidarity, and it's a fascinating moment in the history of the movement because people who gathered together representing all the workers of the country decided to create a kind of a document which was actually an alternative constitution for the country, dealing with a third way, not wanting to have an authoritarian communism on the one side, but also not accepting the, let's say, the capitalistic economy of that time. So it's actually a fascinating document trying to constitute a kind of new utopian vision of the common good, of constituting the relationship between the employee and the employer, but instead of competition, Solidarity proposed cooperation and trust. So it's based completely on completely different fundaments than the economy we can experience today. So, and the common good became the stake in this relationship, and it's difficult to develop a more eloquent formula of the radical project of democracy that Solidarity brought into the 21st century. And I do believe its implementation was interrupted by the martial law in Poland in 1981, but also in 1989, during the time of the successful neoliberal economy. It was simply impossible to trying to create an economy that would be inspired by this kind of utopian thinking Solidarity brought into the world in 1980. So almost a decade after the great turning point that happened around the 1980s, history sped up again with more and more surprising alteration in political reality. So you see the pictures of people gathering together, and I do like this kind of round composition of people gathering together where everybody has a right to speak. It's almost like the birth of ancient democracy in Athens on the Pnyx mountain, when everybody had the right to speak, when everybody's voice was equal, and so on and so on. People gathered together in order to discuss the future of the country. And 1989, the preparation for the roundtable talks, which led to the first free elections in Poland, played this kind of role. I mean, this discursive way of developing democratic space for freedom played a crucial role. And here you see the famous photos from the roundtable talks between the March and April 1989. And then the following so-called roundtable talks that had taken place in Hungary, in Bulgaria, and other Eastern and Central European countries. One of the best round tables, which looks like a triangle, is one from here. I do believe it's the Hungarian one. So we see the processes that taken place in the decade of the 80s and that shaped the entire frame of the world in which we live today. But I do believe what we miss in the European Union is still one of the biggest challenges for the European Union is actually to develop this political and economic project into a cultural one, in which the meaning of common good, but also the politics of everyday life could play an important role in developing or changing or renewing the political model of the European Union. And as you can see, the Solidarity movement was a part of the freedom history, modern freedom history, one of the last movements, last big social mobilization, the last decade, the Occupy Wall Street from 2011 was using the logo or transforming the logo of Solidarity using the formula of together and the slogan, "We are 99%. But I do not believe that we learned a lesson of Solidarity movement after establishing the democratic or developing the democratic institutions in the last decades. So you see the flags of European countries beside the European Parliament, and it's a very nice symbolic gesture that that they were put on the plots which had been made in the Gdańsk shipyard, commemorating also the meaning of solidarity movement. But it's a beautiful symbol. But I do believe there is still to do in case of European solidarity, and especially in case of moralizing politics and politicizing everyday life. So that's the end of my presentation. The author of the Solidarity logo prepared last year the modification of it. As you can see, the keep distance is actually still a crucial message in the time of the pandemic COVID-19. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
that's the end of the story.
Thank you, Dr. Jacek Kołtan, for your notable intervention. So at last, but not at least, our final speaker, Professor Paulo Vila Maior, who is associate professor at the School of Human and Social Sciences in University Fernando Pessoa in Porto, Portugal, and teaches political economy, namely the crisis and the reform of the Eurozone, and Union and policy of international cooperation. He is also a researcher at SPES, Center for Population Economics and Social Studies of University of Porto, and holds a PhD in Contemporary European Studies by Sussex European Institute in the University of Sussex in Brighton, United Kingdom. He was also a coordinator of the model Jean Monnet European Union Politics at University Fernando Pessoa. And his research focuses on political economic aspects of the economic and monetary union, with an emphasis on the crisis and reform of the Eurozone. He is also interested in the constitutionalization of the European Union and on the theorization of European integration. He has several publications on these issues, both in English and in Portuguese. Today, he will let us know about the two tales of a paradox, the rise of new walls in Europe and how history sinks into oblivion. Please, Professor Paulo Vila Maior, do the honors.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking this invitation to give my input to this very interesting conference, which I think leads us to reflections about some of the paradoxes that currently the European Union undergoes. And in my presentation, I will try to focus on the rise of right-wing populism and left-wing populism, and to what extent the rise of these radical political movements is in contrast, is in paradox with the rationale of European integration. So in order to understand my topics, to what extent I will build a reasoning on this issue, I will briefly start by addressing the rationale of European integration, so putting forward some of the most important values of European integration. Then I will emphasize on the lessons of the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and to what extent the fall of the Berlin Wall was so important to enhance European integration. And at the last part of my intervention, I will point out some of the aspects that are the rhetoric and the political program of right-wing movements and left-wing movements, and to what extent they represent the denial of the lessons of history, at least the lessons of history as we perceive them from what we could name mainstream history. Of course, history is open to manifold understandings, and maybe, as I will try to point out, an alternative interpretation of right-wing movements and left-wing movements within the European Union, especially within the European Union, builds upon an alternative perception of history. So let me start by pointing out very briefly that European integration is an epitome of liberty. And I would say that if we try to find out what is the rationale of European integration, three aspects stand out. One, Europe as a project of peace. Secondly, Europe as an idea of tolerance. It is not by accident that unity in diversity is the motto of European integration. And thirdly, Europe as a template for freedoms. It is interesting to consider that the so-called 4 freedoms that are a landmark of European integration, we can understand them as something that tear down walls avant la lettre. Then let me emphasize something which is also very important as far as the fall of the Berlin Wall is considered. So my point is that when the Berlin Wall went down, this was an opportunity to enhance European integration. Obviously, if we go back and when we put ourselves in the shoes of political actors and observers, right at the moment when the Berlin Wall went down, some threats to European integration came to the surface, notably because questions concerning the reunited Germany and to what extent a reunited Germany would be interested to keep on giving its input to European integration. These questions came to the surface, and they also fed some threats, some fears about the sustainable development of European integration from that moment onwards. What is important to understand is that the fall of the Berlin Wall was an opportunity to enhance European integration, since from an early moment of fear, of threat, quickly this was transformed into an opportunity of ambition to growing European integration. Firstly, by bringing Germany back to Europe, that is, tying Germany's hands to Europe with the process of economic and monetary integration. So with the single currency, that was a very important strategic move of both German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and the French President Mitterrand, together with the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors. So tying Germany's hands to Europe was important to assure that Germany would not turn its back to the European project. Secondly, after the Maastricht Treaty, mutual political integration was also an outcome which enhanced European integration. Notably, the fact of the negotiators of the Maastricht Treaty agreed on common foreign and security policy, and to what extent the contents of the then second pillar of the European Union were important to re-establish the full sovereignty of Germany. The third aspect that is an outcome of the fall of the Berlin Wall to the European integration process was a set of interactions and correlations throughout the process of European integration that, in any case, culminated with the process of, on the one hand, the collapse of communism, and at the same time, the reinforcement of European integration. So during the early years of European integration, what was visible was that the process of European integration fostered a peaceful setting, not only within member states of the European communities, but also in a second moment by cooling down the conflict relationship between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. At some point, this ended up with the collapse of communism, which at the same time opened the doors to more European integration. And I would say that this is one of my points. One of the main lessons of the fall of the Berlin Wall was that more European integration was possible. And when we talk about more European integration, we must recognize that this entails, on the one hand, a common understanding of society building, which for a large period of the European integration process was based on the so-called permissive consensus. Secondly, also the emphasis on shared values and the respect for idiosyncrasies and differences. And thirdly, the education for multiculturalism, that is, as member states of the European Union and as citizens of the European Union, we were educated to learn from the other and to overcoming the shred of nationalism based on the lessons taken from history. So this is, I would say, the rationale, not only the rationale of European integration, but especially to what extent the fall of the Berlin Wall was an opportunity to reinforce European integration. But against this backdrop, recently we witnessed not only the rise of right-wing populisms, but also the rise of left-wing populisms. And what is interesting is that in both cases, but for different reasons, right-wing populisms and left-wing populisms, they build on a challenge, a very important challenge to the survival of European integration. So if we focus on right-wing populisms, I would say that the main aspects that stand out are, on the one hand, toxic nationalism, that is, again, the idea of self-centered politics and the possibility of belligerence between countries. Secondly, the idea of the other as a source of mistrust. And thirdly, cultural homogeneity. So but focusing on countries and inward policy that looks after national interests first and foremost, and puts to a secondary position other countries' interests. And also this gives rise to a sort of depreciation of other cultures. So what stands out clearly from these three aspects that are the basic features of right-wing populisms is the fact that right-wing populism neglects the Europe's first half of the 20th century history. But an alternative position is that this is only a new hermeneutics that uploads, I would say, new old values through historical revisionism, notably by intentionally demoting events that hurt right-wing populism narrative. When we turn our attention to left-wing populisms, the many aspects that characterize left-wing populisms are, firstly, a systematic approach against capitalism and globalization. So not only at the level of the European Union, but at the worldwide level. Secondly, and focusing on the European Union itself, a criticism to mainstream European integration based on an argument that points out that the outcome of European integration is clearly a bias against the working class. And it is also, the outcome, it is also a widened gap between the wealthier and the poor. Thirdly, also the movement, the freedom of movements, which is a basic aspect of the history of European integration, is considered as a biased process in terms, since it is in favor of large corporations and not so much in favor of the weakest sectors of the population. And finally, according to left-wing populism, democracy as we know it in the European Union and in the member states of the European Union is only a hidden mask of democracy, since liberal democracy contaminates the rights of the weaker and the poor, and therefore, since the European Union anchors of liberal democracy standards, therefore the European Union perpetuates the dominance of the stronger over the weaker. So when we bring together all these aspects, the assessment of left-wing populisms within the process of European integration is that, again, left-wing populism neglects the Europe recent history, differently from right-wing populisms, where the problem is with the history of the first half of the 20th century. Now, with left-wing populisms, the problem, or let's say the mismatch between their rhetoric or their positions vis-a-vis European integration and Europe is focused on the recent history, notably the legacy of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is important to discuss to what extent obsolete ideological strings are a very important input to left-wing populisms, and to what extent these obsolete ideological strings make up of the opposition of left-wing populisms to the development or even to the survival of the European integration process. An alternative position is likewise as he did it for the right-wing populisms, to consider that we also face a new hermeneutics here that in this case reinvents, again, new old values by rebutting mainstream historical analysis. But now the difference when we put side by side right-wing populisms and left-wing populisms, the difference when we compare it with right-wing populisms is that in the case of left-wing populisms, the rebooting of mainstream historical analysis is based on a reinterpretation of history and to a large extent to some conspirative theories. So when we bring together all these aspects, that is the legacy of European integration, which was reinforced by the fall of the Berlin Wall on the one hand, and on the other hand, the rise and the growing electoral success of right-wing populisms and left-wing populisms, there is a mismatch, a clear mismatch between the history and the foundations of the European Union and the growing electoral success of right-wing populisms and left-wing populisms. And some questions come to the surface. I don't have definitive answers to these, so I leave them open to the floor and to the questions afterwards my presentation. The first question that comes to my mind is, how do we understand the denial of history, at least from the standpoint of mainstream historical analysis? That is, the analysis, the history that we learn going back to schools and that we also teach in universities, for instance, how is it understandable that left-wing populisms and right-wing populisms deny history or at least rewrite history? Second question, which is also very important, but at a different level, I would say more at the level of political strategy, and to what extent this also involves some kind of political philosophy analysis. Because the question that comes to the surface is, what is the possible reaction of the European Union to the growing electoral success of right-wing populism and left-wing populism? Well, one possible strategy is to encompass right-wing and left-wing populisms as insiders of the political system. Nevertheless, this involves the risk of giving rise to implosion from within. An alternative strategy is to reject right-wing and left-wing populisms as political actors, as mainstream political actors. That, nevertheless, the risk connected with this strategy is that this political strategy runs against the pluralistic foundations of European integration. What is important to emphasize is that both right-wing populisms and left-wing populisms, maybe more the former than the latter, they have been attracting more and more voters, throughout many European countries. And this is not to be neglected. So I'm not saying that we should just shut the door to radical political movements that are against European integration, because they can trigger the implosion from within. Nevertheless, the two alternative possibilities from the political reaction or for the political reaction of the European Union, they give rise to important political philosophical questions that I think deserve some attention, some reflection, so that we might find an answer to what extent the survival of the European integration process is consistent with the current trend of more and more electoral success of right-wing and left-wing populisms. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Paulo Vila Maior, for a remarkable presentation. So initial presentations closed. I believe that I don't have questions here at the chat. I would like to ask the speakers if anyone would like to comment any of the other interventions of the other speakers. Okay, Professor Konrad, floor is yours.
I wanted to make a compliment to our colleague from Gdańsk. You have presented a very attractive understanding of the ethics of solidarity. I'm just not sure how easily these ethics are translatable to the level of European politics. And the last speaker, I am also pleased with the engagement of different kinds of histories of left-wing and right-wing populism. I think they all deal with the past, but they rewrite the past in order to justify their own points of view. And some of it, of course, has to do with the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century as a justification for European integration. And some of it has to do also with the transformation problems after 1990. And in the communist case, you can, of course, say it's the problem of communism, the legacy that has messed up the world. But the longer we go away from that, the less convincing it is. And so we also have to engage mistakes of transformation policies and argue about those. So those are just a couple of comments.
Very, very well, Professor Konrad. I don't know if the other two speakers would like to respond. Jacek, Kołtan, please go ahead.
Thank you for the question. And I mean, my answer will be a sad one. So I do not believe there is a simple and easy way of translating the ethics of solidarity into the, let's say, 21st century. It's a just completely different world. You know, I mean, when we think about the solidarity movement, we talk about the late industrial mobilization that took place at the end of the 80s and at the end of the 80s, and Europe and the world was introducing the post-industrial societies and just completely another model of the culture of work and the economical model. But nevertheless, I do believe there are some impulses we can, let's say, learn from the history, which is not an easy process. And the first thing is, I do believe the concentration of the economic and political transformation of Europe in the last decades, and without concentration on the European culture and, I mean, cultural integration is one of the weaknesses of the European Union. And when I think about the movement bottom up, dealing with the politics as a part of everyday life, then I do believe what I miss in the European Union integration processes is culture, also investments in cultural projects, and I'm afraid we are missing a vision for cultural integration of Europe still. I mean, it's 2021, and the second lesson from the decades of the solidarity mobilization in Poland would be redefining European solidarity. I mean, the idea of solidarity had to be institutionalized by the European Union, which is a fascinating moment in the let's say, development of institutionalized democracy. But it's not very much clear. I mean, solidarity was put into the parts of the European law dealing with actually the work. But what I miss is actually also the thinking about the solidarity idea as a point of reference for that what I mentioned earlier for the cultural integration of Europe, but also, I mean, stronger political integration of the European, I mean, the member states of the European Union. When we observe what is going on with the COVID-19 and the lack of the immediate decisions that had to be made in order to get more vaccine and faster the vaccination process, then and when we compare the situation of the European Union with the US of A or Great Britain, then I do believe we are missing some elements that could make the European Union much more decisive and much more concrete. So that's what I miss, and that's how I read the lesson from the late 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you.
Professor Paulo Vila Maior, please go ahead.
Yes, yes, I would add something. Konrad, thank you for your remarks. Yes, you have a point. So I'm not saying that my argument is not that the process of European integration is perfect. Far from that, in terms of political and economic outcomes, notably in recent years. Let's not forget what happened with the Eurozone crisis. This is a clear indication that the political process, and when I mean the political process, I'm thinking about the European Union as a whole, but together with member states or national governments, they did not deliver in a way which was considered satisfactory by large sectors of the population. And maybe this is one of the reasons why right-wing, especially right-wing populisms have so much electoral success in recent elections all over Europe. That is one thing. At a different dimension is the fact that the ideology, the rhetoric of both right-wing politicians and left-wing politicians is to a large extent based on the oblivion of history. And what is puzzling to me is that many voters still feel attracted by a program and a rhetoric which is clearly based on the denial, or at least on the rewriting of history. So maybe what is at stake here is a deficit of historical knowledge, or maybe that is an alternative interpretation for the voters of right-wing movements and left-wing movements. More important than the mistakes, the past mistakes that come from history, is that these political movements, they are a reaction to the inappropriate political and economic answer to the challenges of nowadays politics.
All right, so I have three questions for the panel, which are, one of the main cores of Project Nowall is to counter the idea that Europe was a relatively passive actor during the Cold War. At a time when Europe is seen to assert itself as a multilateral power, what are the main challenges to achieve that goal? Also, like Professor Paulo Vila Maior has mentioned very, very often, we see the escalation of populism and anti-democratic practices across Europe. The European Union seeks to counterattack by developing its pillar of social rights, and we see the Portuguese presidency with a social summit. And in response to the pandemic, looking for a fair distribution of vaccines for COVID. Dr. Jacek Kołtan was talking about that right now. My question about this is, one of the things is that the process of distribution of vaccines is going frankly bad. So my question is, what needs to change in Europe so that it can be more consistent in responding to the problems and challenges it faces? And finally, and this is a bit of a provocation, like I said earlier, when I was describing the biography of Professor Paulo Vila Maior, you have been interested in the idea of constitutionalization of Europe. My question to all the panel is that possible? And if that is possible, if it's possible now, or if it's possible in the future? And I would like to add one little question to this, is that, and if it's possible, how is it possible if it's not happening right now? So these are my three questions that I would like to hear the panel with. we will follow I think now we will follow the inverse order. So I will give the word to Professor Paulo Vila Maior, and we go in the inverse order to Jacek and to Professor Konrad.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I will not focus on the three questions that you addressed, but only on two of them. One relates the constitutionalization of European integration. So I have a personal point of view, which is that process is taking place already. So when we talk about the Treaty on the European Union, well, at the end of the day, the Treaty on the European Union is already the constitution of the European Union. What we might think about is how to develop the constitutionalization of European integration, notably, to what extent is it possible to reinforce the powers of the European Union? To what extent are member states prepared to transfer more powers to the supranational level? And to what extent is this envisaged by the population as a process of creating a sort of political union with many alternative meanings, ranging from a federation of states to a super state on the making? I would rule out this possibility because I think that for historical reasons, and also for political reasons, notably the embedded sovereignty in member states, it is very difficult to think about creating something similar to the United States of Europe, for instance. So maybe if you think about the future development of European integration within the framework of a constitutional setting, I would say that the more feasible option is a step forward towards a federation of states, but still with member states as key players within the process of European integration. I am aware that by stating this point, I am open to a criticism to the extent that maybe this also only reinforces one of the paradoxes of European integration. And I would say that this paradox comes from the perception that many times it is national interests that block the development of European integration. And at the end of the day, the obstacles to the development of European integration run against member states themselves. So this is paradoxical. And I would say that maybe the main obstacle comes from history, comes from tradition, comes from the mainstream perception that sovereignty, national sovereignty, is still almost a sacred goal to be respected. And to that extent, it is very difficult to think about, I would say, a short to medium-term development of European integration alongside these lines that I exposed. As far as the process of vaccination and to what extent this was an opportunity to bring the European Union, notably the European Commission, to the fore, well, I would say that that was an attempt of the European Commission, but clearly the process is full of weaknesses, as we are all witnessing. And I would say that this was an attempt, and maybe this attempt of the European Commission was plagued with an excess of political willingness. That is, the European Union, the European Commission trying to stand up as a very important institution, which already is, but with some kind of political clothing, which up to this moment, that was not the role of the European Commission. As we are all aware of, the main role of the European Commission is to act as a legislative initiator, not as a political entrepreneur. So it is not, I would say it's not a surprising outcome that the European Commission did not perform well in this process of European Union-wide vaccination.
Okay, Jacek?
I would go in the direction that Paulo Vila Maior decided to go, and would say more Europe. It's the answer to your three questions, actually. But it won't be easy. I mean, it's a kind of political experiment. And I'm very much interested in how this kind of far developed institutionalization of the political life can answer the questions concerning the world risk we have to confront with in the, let's say, late modernity we are the children of. So for me, it's very interesting to observe how this advanced, fascinating political structure of this organism called European Union react to the moments that that are actually a key moments redefining the entire situation we are in. And for that purpose, it's of course when we observe this lack of decisionism, lack of decision making in this crucial moments, that I would call for more Europe, for more integration, which won't be easy and which won't be an easy project. It's actually a development of something what we do not know, but it takes place for sure. I mean, on this level of development of law in the last decades in a fascinating way. And I do believe we are also, we do need more European and not national leaders. When I observe how Mario Draghi tries to find the space for Europe in acting as one of political leaders, then I do get some hope that this kind of presenting the European agenda as a main purpose and main problem for the European integration could help in the future. We will see. I mean, it's a very hard moment. I'm very much afraid of what is going on in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in my country, in Poland, and in Hungary, with the illiberal democracy or counter-revolution we observe in the last couple of years. But I also think it's a consequence of that we do not have more Europe. So when I watch the TV, when I hear the news in the TV or in radio, when I read the news in the newspapers, so the topics of the European integration, of the European problems, are actually not there. So we lack a real, truly European discourse, and we really lack the information how to translate this kind of complex politics that takes place on the level of the European Union into the everyday life of citizens, and the way how Ursula von der Leyen, for example, try to communicate through this short videos on the social media. It's definitely a very good solution to open a kind of a communication channel between the advanced technology of the politics, very complicated, very complex politics, and the everyday life of citizens. So I would say more Europe, but it does not mean I have the answers to the detailed answers to the questions. Thank you.
All right, and at last, but not at least, Professor Konrad. Sorry, Professor, we'll have to activate the...
Yeah, you need to unmute the...
You need to unmute, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, now it's good.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to thank you for your questions. The first one with the Cold War, I think, was very interesting, because there's a lot of bad Cold War history being written that writes the Europeans out of the history of the Cold War and makes them into a battlefield. Whereas even on the level of East and West Germany, the Verantwortungsgemeinschaft, the concept of a common sense of responsibility for preventing nuclear war is important. And you can go back, certainly in the decade of the 1980s, the Europeans were putting pressure on Washington and on Moscow in order not to become the battlefield of World War III. And that is a history of success that is not much there. I've been involved in trying to establish a museum of the Cold War in Berlin, and this is one of the messages that we wanted to convey. You don't have to have confrontation that leads to war. You can also overcome it, but you have to work on it. I think we all know that majority voting is what would be required on the European level in order to get decisions made. And as long as we have individual national veto powers, we will not get much beyond the current situation. Although I think the rebuilding fund in the COVID discussion and is a step towards mutualization of debt. And, as long as, if we can get somewhat further in being fiscally co-responsible across nations in Europe, that I think will help as well. There has to be a sense of common interest, and this interest, of course, requires sacrifices. And I agree also with my colleague on the need for a European cultural identity and self-image. And of course, the EU has been, first of all, coal and steel, and then common market, and then, complete integration and common currency, and so on. But this is all economic. And I think the efforts to support European identity on the cultural level have been kind of feeble, which is understandable because all the different languages and cultures and so on. E pluribus unum is the American motto on the currency. And, one out of many is a sort of European version of it. That takes a while to be learned. And I think from a historical point of view of the last 30 years, I would also counsel patience. I think we have to remember the tremendous changes from the height of Cold War to the collapse of communism and the retreat of the Soviet Union and so on. And this is just on individual life levels, tremendous stuff. And in earlier decades or centuries, it would have required World War III. And we didn't have World War III. We have a kind of critique on the left and on the right. And to some degree, that critique is justified because the EU doesn't always deliver what it promises. But if we have patience and if we keep working on a sense of common cultural identity, and if we can change some of the mechanisms of the EU, like majority voting, then I think we will be on the right path. Thank you.
All right, so I would like to thank to all of the speakers for your rather fascinating perspectives, and to give a special thanks to all those who have participated in all of these discussions of the project Nowall. So now, for me, it's my time to say goodbye and pass the word to Felix to make the closing remarks. Thank you very much for this discussion. For me, it was very enlightening, and so we will see you in next moments, in other moments.
Thank you very much, Tomas. And thank you all the speakers for your enlightenment. Sorry, can you hear me?
Reverb. Probably you will have two machines, like a phone or a computer or something like that, and it's making noise. Try again. Okay.
Maybe in the meantime, I would like just to make one more question to Jacek Kołtan, if it's okay.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I was just wondering about the solidarity. If the success of solidarity was also dependent on the religious unison, the Catholic unison of the population, because as you said, it was like half of the Polish population that joined the movement. And since there was John Paul II, and then seeing the crucifix on the picture as well, I was just wondering, and what are your thoughts about that?
Mm. I mean, it was a very complex phenomenon, and with a lot of identities merging together. So on the one hand, this role of Catholic Church and the role of religion in the everyday life of the Polish population played for sure a very important role, and you can see it on the symbols, on the pictures of the mobilizations, protest movements, and so on and so on. But one cannot forget it's the most important element of this movement, of this mobilization, was the fact it was a workers' movement, and that the establishing of independent trade unionism in a classless society and in authoritarian communism was actually the main aim or the main phase of the movement. So there was also a tendency to the national independence, and I do believe it's symbolically visible in the logo of Solidarity, you know, on the top of this triangle of the Solidarity logo, you got the national flag. But you know, at the same time, the movement universalized this kind of experience of liberating from the authoritarianism in Central and Eastern Europe and sending letters to other workers and activists in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So it's actually a fascinating phenomenon which has very many phases, but the dominant one, in my opinion, is the workers' one. So it in this sense, it actually develops the old 19th century tradition of liberating the workers from the oppressive political and economic system. But it's a complex question. It's for sure, and there's no simple answer to that, because some crucial traditions are put together in one movement that made also the success of the movement possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Your
you.
presentation was very engaging, and I'm looking forward when the European Solidarity Center will be open.
Thank you very much. Feel invited, you all, to come to Gdańsk to the European Solidarity Center when we can travel. I mean, I'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Don't say that two times, that it makes us remember that we can travel right now because of COVID, and I start beginning to stay sad because of it. Professor Paulo Vila Maior and Professor Konrad, do you want any commentary on this? No? Okay. Felix, so now.
Wait a minute. I think Paulo was saying something, but he's mute. He's muted.
No, I'm on now. I was just saying that I have no further comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
Felix?
Can you hear me right now?
Clear now.
Oh, that's great now.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. You can.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, but there's some technical problem here. I think because having the YouTube connected to see if the transmission was working well. Okay, I have to thank you all so much for this afternoon, because it's very great to hear your points of views in this periodical and in more contemporary history of our continent of Europe. In terms of the project, this is the last debate that we make. We'll have a workshop in 9th of May, but is an offline workshop. Is not something that will put internet. So in terms of having something available online, this is the last one, and I pretty much can say that this was one of the greatest. It's difficult to say, oh, this one is better than that one, okay, but I think as a closing debate, I love it. Thank you so much for your participation. and your contribute to to this discussion, because I think just adding something to the things that you said. I think if we do not discuss these situations, if not discuss our history, if we don't talk about the things, I think the European project cannot go further, because we only can fight against extremism and far right or very far left if we discuss the things, if we make it possible to people have access to the information, okay? Because it's true that we live in an era that everyone has access to internet, but there's a lot of noise, okay? There's a lot of noise in the internet, and it's difficult sometimes to the common citizen to understand the difference between this information or that information, okay? And the more we talk about these subjects, the better. And then in the general, in terms of the project, I think we achieve at least the principal objectives of this project with these debates that we have today, for example. Okay, for that, I have to thank you so much for your participation, and not only in the name of young educators, but also in the name of the other partners, principally ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon, University of Helsinki, Willy Brandt Foundation of Berlin, CAT Projects of Netherlands, and also Jeff Helsinki also. So, and I have also to thank you to European Union to help us, because it's true, without their help, we couldn't be here today and make this great event. Thank you very much, and I hope the things get better in terms of pandemic, so you can come to Lisbon and we can make the end of the debate drinking some beers or something like that you prefer. Okay, thank you so much. I hope to see you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.